Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give it a couple minutes to fill the room up here. Good afternoon again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give it about another minute to fill the room up here. Good afternoon again, everyone. We'll give about 30 more seconds to fill the room. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for our Wednesday webinar series. This week's webinar is Ensuring Health Equity with Emerging Therapies. My name is Brett Spatella. I am the Vice President of Advancement here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. If at any time during the webinar you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We have NHF staff members monitoring these questions and will present them to the presenter after the presentation. This week, we are joined by the one and only Dr. Len Valentino, the CEO and President of the National Hemophilia Foundation. Len, I will now turn it over to you to get us started, sir.
Thanks, Brett, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming from. Today, I wanted to talk about ensuring health equity with emerging therapies. So these are my disclosures. There's nothing to disclose for this presentation, and the opinions that I'm going to present are my own and not necessarily reflective of those of the National Hemophilia Foundation or its board of directors. So I'd like to start out with the mission of the National Hemophilia Foundation, which is dedicated to finding cures for inheritable blood disorders and to addressing and preventing the complications of these disorders through research, education, and advocacy, enabling people and families to thrive. It's important to maintain this grounded mission as we move forward. So what I'll tell you is we'll talk first about a little bit about health equity, the landscape of innovation, and then I'll end with some call to action. So let's begin with health equity. So I wanted to go back to the mission statement and really focus on the last line there that I have in the box, enabling people and families to thrive. And this is really what the goal of equity is. Equitable healthcare, equitable delivery of healthcare, and of course, equitable access to healthcare is really what we're looking for so that people can thrive. And why are we doing this? It's for the benefit of those we serve. It's for the people who live with these disorders, whether they have hemophilia, von Willebrand disease, a platelet disorder, sickle cell disease, hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, or a platelet disorder. We really want to ensure that we're serving the people who need our help the most. So when we think about assessing benefit, it's important to look at various different parameters. Some might think about musculoskeletal health. Others might look at the cost of care. But I think most importantly, you can see in the blue section of the pie diagram that health-related quality of life is the most commonly reported outcome of importance to people who have bleeding disorders. So the patient's voice should really be the loudest. And what matters most to people who live with a bleeding disorder or a blood disorder really should be where we're emphasizing our efforts. So we talk about what is the goal. And as I said, I think that health equity should be the goal. And we should be striving for functional cures. And the graph on the right-hand side looks at the increase in innovation and the decrease in morbidity, mortality, with improving outcomes over the course of time with various different innovations that have been brought to the hemophilia community. I would argue that we need to do the same, not just for hemophilia, but for the blood disorders community. And our goal in the blood disorders community should equally be functional cure and health equity, so that we're not just focusing on hemophilia, but all blood disorders. So our vision has also evolved to a world without inheritable blood disorders, first focusing on the cure and then the inclusion of all blood disorders. So let's look at the landscape of innovation for a few minutes, and we'll look at 4 areas: biopharmaceuticals, or drugs that we have used in the past, devices, digital, and diagnostics. And I think it's important when we think about these 4 areas, these are all areas for transformative innovation in our communities. So one of the things that I like to think about is the evolution in medical care. And we're at a point now where we're thinking about ensuring that we can deliver the right drug in the right dose at the right time. In the past, it was much a trial and error process. Think back just 15 years ago, trial and error in prophylaxis was, let's give a dose, see how well it works. If there's breakthrough bleeding, then we can adjust the dose, adjust the regimen. That's the past, the trial and error approach. In the present, we're looking at targeted, personalized approaches to treatment, using, for example, pharmacokinetics, or various different products with various half-lives or mechanisms of action to be able to deliver targeted, personalized approaches to therapies. So the evolution of medicine has come a long way. Many, many decades ago, even centuries ago, we had a heuristic approach to medical care, depending heavily on the physician's skills. The diagnosis was based on symptoms, and treatment effectiveness was often uncertain. And the model for payment was a fee-for-service model. So this was something that was in place for many, many years, and really was the underpinning for our medical care. We then moved towards empirical medicine. And what I mean here is that this depends on standard protocols. We now have excellent guidelines. For example, the World Federation of Hemophilia guidelines for the treatment of hemophilia. The Medical and Scientific Advisory Council of the National Hemophilia Foundation, and the guidelines from the NHF McMaster project on standard procedures for managing people with bleeding disorders. The diagnosis is oftentimes based on pattern recognition. Patient presents early in life with a joint bleed. There's no other reason for that patient to have a joint bleed, and the child is diagnosed with hemophilia based on laboratory tests. The effectiveness is predicted by probabilities. It's more likely than not that the patient will respond to a recombinant factor VIII product if he has hemophilia A, or a factor IX replacement product for hemophilia B. But is that universally true? Not necessarily. It's a probabilistic model that we've used for decades. And again, we charge for a fee for service for our care. And I think what we're moving towards is precision medicine. And precision medicine really depends on single patient-based therapies. It's looking, again, at the right drug in the right dose at the right time. The diagnosis can be precisely made. We now have the opportunity to bring genetic diagnosis in. We saw recently with the publication of the von Willebrand disease guidelines for diagnosis and treatment of von Willebrand disease. Diagnosis is now encouraged using specialized tests, including genetic testing. So we have the opportunity to make precise diagnosis. And later in the presentation, we'll talk more about how the My Life, Our Future program can help us in learning more about diagnostic issues. The disease causes are now more fully understood. For the last 20 years, we've had the benefit of the Human Genome Project and really understanding the genetic basis for many, many diseases. And we understand the specific mutations in more cases than not for hemophilia. We're learning more about the genetic diagnosis of von Willebrand disease and platelet disorders and other blood disorders as well. outcomes are predictably effective. And this is based on extensive clinical trial data, but more importantly, on the development of real world evidence and based on real world data that's collected from people who live with these disorders. And again, I would move towards the payment scheme that's been used. Should treatment be charged on a fee-for-service basis, or should there be other innovative approaches that really pay for performance of the treatments and the diagnostic tools that are used? So I would argue that we're moving towards more of a precision medicine and potentially a precision funding approach for the care of people with blood disorders. So we think about patient-centered care, and precision medicine in the blood disorders can be based on pharmacokinetic profiling. We've seen that work quite well in hemophilia, especially with hemophilia A and B. We can measure factor levels with consistent assays. Bleeding risk profile has also been performed using various phenotypic markers. We're now emerging into the area of looking at biomarkers. Some excellent work is being done to identify new biomarkers that are predictive of joint disease. Joint status and target joints has been a subject of investigation for many, many years. We have the joint scoring capabilities. We also now have point of care musculoskeletal ultrasound to really start to define the status of joints as we move forward. And we have performance measures like the functional measures of the FISH and the hemophilia activities list. We also have tools to be able to assess work and sport activity and productivity, as well as compliance and adherence with the treatment regimens. But what remains a challenge for us is bleeding recognition. More often than not, about half the time, neither patients nor healthcare professionals can accurately diagnose bleeding without some additional intervention. And I point back then to the value of musculoskeletal ultrasound and the potential for biomarkers into the future to identify bleeding in people so that we can intervene earlier and hopefully prevent the damage that might ensue. As we think about patient-centered care, we should also be thinking about patient empowerment and activation. Disease and treatment understanding will enhance adherence to therapies. Shared decision-making and the tools that are used for shared treatment decision-making is incredibly important. Achieving concordance between the healthcare professional and the person who lives with a bleeding disorder or blood disorder is important as well, so that we have a clear understanding of what the goals of treatment are. And then, of course, adjusting activity and lifestyle, not to the treatment, but more adjusting the treatment to the patient's lifestyle and desired levels of activity. So we really have work to do to really become a more patient-centered healthcare system for blood disorders. So as we look at what the possibilities are, I would say that we need real-world data collection. I've made this argument before for von Willebrand disease. The real benefit of the von Willebrand disease guidelines will be in educating healthcare professionals, educating the people who potentially have von Willebrand disease, the general community, as well as those diagnosed with von Willebrand disease about the optimal treatment options available to them. But I think collecting real-world data on the value of the treatment guidelines will be incredibly important as we move forward. The guidelines are only as good as the outcomes that they're able to achieve. So we need to have good outcome tracking for blood disorders. We need to have treatment tracking, and it's best to do this in a non-invasive manner. And then we also have to have good benchmarking capabilities. What does good look like? And we can only achieve this by collaborating with the entire community, healthcare professionals, the people who live with these disorders, payers, and policymakers coming together to create that benchmarking so that we have that concordance in the community. And through that, we can then generate improved outcomes and value for money. And this is truly patient-centered care. And I think that when we're able to achieve patient-centered care, we will be closer towards health equity in the blood disorders community. So what are the opportunities that exist when we think about innovations? I'd like to point out the My Life, Our Future program. And I recently attended a presentation delivered by Dr. Barbara Konkel, where she summarized some of the key results from the My Life, Our Future program. We've learned a great deal about the causes of hemophilia, including the large heterogeneity in genetic diagnoses. But despite the heterogeneity, there are common mechanisms of disease that we understand. I think these will lead to better diagnostics. It'll lead to better and the possibility of bringing biomarkers of disease state into the treatment of people with hemophilia. And of course, will in the future hopefully lead to precision therapeutics. But I think it's important that we extend the work of My Life, Our Future into other blood disorders, to von Willebrand disease, to platelet disorders, to the rare and ultra rare bleeding disorders as well as other blood disorders. We need the diagnostics, the biomarkers, and precision therapeutics for all blood disorders. What other opportunities exist? The My Life, Our Future told us a lot about the development of inhibitors, the prediction of inhibitors, and of course, the opportunity that we may be able to have novel interventions to potentially prevent inhibitors into the future. So I think work like My Life, Our Future, where we're able to bring phenotypic data together with genotypic data, and more importantly now, we have the opportunity to bring other genetic information into that, whether it's the proteasome or the transcriptome along with the genetic information, will be incredibly important to understand the mechanisms of disease and provide new treatments for people with blood disorders. I also saw a presentation by Dr. Pipe where he was talking about innovative biopharmaceuticals. And I think, again, opportunities exist in this area to bring health equity, rebalancing the coagulation system. Many, many different new mechanisms of action are available and are currently in clinical development. Only through the development pathways and the participation of people who live with these disorders will we really be able to realize the potential for these innovative biopharmaceuticals. But then more importantly, we have to continue to collect real-world evidence to support the use and importantly, the reimbursement for these innovative treatments for people with blood disorders. So what do people with hemophilia want? I think they want to thrive, to be healthy, to be happy, and to live a fulfilled life. I think that this is what the last statement of the NHF mission statement is getting at, for allowing people and families to thrive. And I think this is when we can achieve health equity. I don't believe that health equity should be defined differently depending on where you live. In low and middle income countries, why should the definition for health equity be different than what it is in a high income country like the United States or Europe? I think that all people should have the opportunities to thrive and be happy and be healthy. So no matter what the issues are, whether it's diagnostic or it's therapeutics, I think there's certain responsibilities that all of us have. For healthcare professionals, I think it's incumbent that we become better educated about what the innovations are in terms of diagnostics, in terms of digital technologies, in terms of new therapeutics that are available to us. We also have to work with payers to educate them on the value of these innovative therapies that are coming so that they can also understand the value and what patients perceive as valuable. We need to work with policymakers as well so that the policymakers can help support us. We're at a time right now where telehealth is used extensively in certain parts of the country, as well as other parts of the world. But that is in jeopardy if policymakers don't act to be able to ensure continued access to telehealth into the future. It's not only for telehealth, it's also for innovative diagnostics. We talked previously about the importance of genetic testing and how we can utilize genetic tests to do precision diagnostics. We need more diagnostic codes that are available for genetic tests. I understand that there's over 7,000 rare genetic diseases. There's also many, many of those who now have the opportunity for a genetic diagnosis. But unfortunately, we only have a few handfuls of procedural codes to identify those genetic tests. We need to work with policymakers to increase the number of procedural codes to clearly identify what those genetic tests are, so that payers are willing to compensate laboratories for that work, and that patients have access to those genetic tests, for example. But I think it's also important that people who wish to receive these therapies are also activated and understand what their responsibilities are. I think it's important that they continue to report their data. Providing real-world data is incredibly important. We now have opportunities for data collection through the American Thrombosis and Hemostasis Network. I think it's very important that Athens continues to collect the real-world data on patients in the United States. In the rest of the world, we also have the World Federation of Hemophilia Bleeding Disorders Registry. I think it's important that we continue to collect that type of data throughout the world so that we can have that benchmarking information. We can see, are we achieving health equity, or how far are we from that? So I think we all have work to do, including the people who live with these disorders and wish to receive innovative therapies. But I think pharmaceutical research and development is risk-prone. It's costly and it's time-consuming. So a couple of statistics here. The probability of marketing approval is between 7 and 45%, depending on the technology that you're looking at. So more than half of drugs and devices never make it to the market. Patients who could benefit from these never see these innovations come to them because of the challenges in development of drugs and diagnostics. Only a minority of those approved achieve commercial success. We saw this to be the case with the first gene therapy that was approved, Glybera, for a rare form of genetic disease. Although it was approved in Europe, there was no commercial advantage to this, and the drug was eventually withdrawn from the European market because of lack of commercial success. And of course, sustainable access to innovative medicines is always a concern. That's why our public policy work and our payer work is so incredibly important to continue to sustain access to medicines once approved, and that we have people who live with these disorders understanding the benefits of them and taking advantage and leveraging them to their benefit. But we also have to have healthcare professionals understand how to use these medicines and engage in shared decision-making with the person who's affected by the disorder. Only through a shared decision-making approach can we really achieve that health equity, which is our goal. So why are there inequities in access to care? There were a number of healthcare professional surveys that have been done in the past. And I think one of the major problems is many bleeding disorders present with mild symptomatology and therefore don't rise to the level of concern for healthcare professionals. Heavy menstrual bleeding may be the primary symptom in about 6 out of 10 women who present with a bleeding disorder. The healthcare professional may not understand or recognize the importance of heavy menstrual bleeding. Importantly, patients who live in rural areas often experience diagnostic delays, as socioeconomic status also plays into this. The graph on the left-hand side at the top shows the importance of socioeconomic status in terms of diagnostic delays. In this healthcare survey, exploring barriers to access to care, there was a need to have increase in knowledge around rarer and usually unknown bleeding disorders. The lack of general healthcare professional awareness lack of diagnostic certainty, the complexities of these tests and the inability to interpret those tests, and of course, the lack of patient awareness about the possibility of a bleeding disorder diagnosis. So we have a lot of challenges in terms of achieving equitable access to diagnosis and therapy. So I'd like to now sort of wrap up at the end and talk a little bit about a call to action. What can we do as individuals to achieve health equity? Well, I like this anonymous quote. Everything in your life is a reflection of a choice you have made. If you want a different result, make a different choice. Now, I think it's really important that we all take that to heart. We need to do some things differently. Whether you're a healthcare professional or a person living with a bleeding disorder or a blood disorder, a payer, a policymaker, or a researcher, if we want to see things be different, we need to take action and we need to do things a bit differently. So I want to focus on the social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health are conditions in the environment where people are born, where they live, where they learn, where they might work or play, where they worship, and of course, as they age during the lifespan, that affect a wide range of health and functioning and quality of life outcomes, as well as the risks. So we can look at education and access to quality education, economic stability, social and community context. Just the ability to have playgrounds in the area is incredibly important in terms of social well-being and the outcomes for people's health. Having access to food and pharmacies, what other things in the neighborhood that are important. Again, it's the green spaces that we all want to appreciate. All of these impact the social determinants of health. And healthcare access and quality is only one of these social determinants of health. All of these other things play a major role in determining the outcomes. It's been said that your zip code may be more important than your genetic code in determining your health outcome. So if we want to achieve better outcomes for people with blood disorders, we need to begin to look at in earnest at the social determinants of health and begin to address these social determinants of health. So how might we do that? Well, health equity is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. How might we do this as an organization? It's first identifying the needs and the priorities for a population. To this end, we've brought in Dr. Carrie Norris, a health equity, inclusion, and diversity expert to help us identify the needs and create priorities for our populations. We need to set targets. We need to have goals in mind about what we seek to achieve. We can only set these targets through collaboration with the communities by listening to all of you in the community. And that's true whether you're a healthcare professional or a person living with a blood disorder or a payer or a policymaker. We need to have those targets set that we can all agree on. And we're looking towards 2022 when we can have a health equity summit and bring the important voices together to identify what these targets might be. Then we need to find practical tools. Many of these tools already exist in other areas of the communities, but we need to bring them to leverage and to bear on the blood disorders community. And of course, any effort has to be monitored and we have to see progress moving forward. If we're not seeing progress, we have to change the course of what we're doing. And I think this is incredibly important for us to be able to achieve health equity. It's clearly identifying the needs and the priorities, then setting our targets with the community, and then finding those tools and implementing those tools and monitoring its progress. So what will our challenges be? I think that the coronavirus and COVID-19 is essentially here to stay. I think we were feeling fairly good in May and June about coming out of the pandemic. But I think in July, we're realizing this pandemic is not going away anytime soon. Viruses are designed to mutate, and we're seeing this now with the Delta variant. The Delta variant is a far more contagious virus than we dealt with in the past. So I think that coronavirus and COVID-19 is going to continue to be a challenge for us and will continue to be a challenge for health equity. But I also think diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to be dealt with directly. And we need to have a plan to be able to do this. It's not NHF's plan, it needs to be the community plan. And we need to work with all of you. And I like the cartoons on the right-hand side, but really what's most important is not giving individuals, equity by giving them what they need. It's important to liberate them. Why not just take the fence down? Why not remove the barrier that's been there preventing them from seeing the ball game? So it's really around achieving inclusion. And inclusion is bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into the processes, the activities, and the decisions and policy making in a way that shares power and ensures equal access to opportunities and resources. Only through this inclusion will we truly be able to address the social determinants of health and overcome the issues that we're currently facing in our communities and strive for health equity. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and offer the opportunity for questions. And I'll turn it back to Brett.
Great. Thanks, Len. Really appreciate it. We do have some questions that have come in. The first one is, how do you define equitable healthcare, and what are currently the biggest barriers to achieving these for the blood disorders community?
Well, I think equitable healthcare can be defined in many different ways. But I think what's most important about defining equitable healthcare is giving people access to the important services, the important treatments. It's all about ensuring access. And I think many of the barriers that we currently have include, for example, the lack of pharmacies in communities and the inability for people to gain access to their medications. I think it's also important, we're seeing more around, I think, some really unfortunate practices in the payer community around things like the copay accumulator. These are preventing access to medications for people who desperately need life-saving medications. So I think there's many different definitions of health equity and how we can achieve equitable care, but I think it really requires us all working together into the future.
Thanks, Len. Next question that comes in is, I've heard a lot about shared decision-making for patient and physicians in determining treatment and care. How does that fit into this vision?
So shared decision-making, I think, is a critical component of this. People who live with blood disorders, and for that matter, people who live with any health condition, really need to be a participant in their own healthcare. They need to be activated and they need to be empowered to participate in the decision-making process. The first step in that decision-making process is to become knowledgeable, to become aware of what your options are. And that's, again, a requirement for people who live with the disorders as well as for healthcare professionals. Healthcare professionals need to be willing to share this information with patients. In the past, we've had a very paternalistic, maternalistic healthcare system, where as a physician, I make the decision and you as the patient follow what I tell you you should be doing. It doesn't always work that way because I don't, as a physician, necessarily understand what your goals and your objectives might be for your care. So it's important that we engage in that dialogue and we have a frank and forthright and honest discussion about what the goals and objectives for you might be and what the goals and objectives for the physician or healthcare professional might be as well. So I think it begins with both parties entering in to an agreement to share in an open and honest way and authentically have these types of discussions so that we can have this first step in shared decision making. Then it's incumbent upon both parties to become as fully knowledgeable as possible about all of the different treatment options. I can tell you from my own personal experience as a physician, I participated in a number of clinical trials. I felt comfortable with those new agents that I was researching in clinical trials. But it was important for me to become comfortable with other products that maybe I didn't have as much familiarity with. I needed to do the work that was necessary so that I can inform my patients and give them an unbiased representation of what their options were. And I think the next step in that is really breaking down those barriers in communication and eliminating any potential bias on either the part of the person with the blood disorder or the healthcare professional who's delivering that. And then we mutually discuss and achieve consensus. What do we want to do? How are we going to do it? And more importantly, when are we going to do it? And then follow it. How are we going to monitor this? Because we may have to make changes and course corrections along the way. But shared decision-making is a true collaboration between the individual with a blood disorder and the healthcare professional.
Great. I've got one more question, or I've got a couple more questions here, Len, and then I see we've got some in the Q&A there as well. I'll start with this one, and then maybe we can get to those. In data collection, and you touched a little bit on this, but I don't know, this might give you an opportunity to elaborate a little bit. In data collection, unprecedented groups of patients are often not or only minimally included. How can we assure that their voices are heard and valued to move towards a more equitable healthcare system?
So again, I think this is, it's a great question, and I think it focuses on the need to activate patients and to empower people who live with these disorders to become active participants in their care. Everybody has a responsibility, as I pointed out in one of the slides. And I think it's the responsibility of somebody who's receiving healthcare to be an active and engaged participant. If I'm taking a particular medication, I need to be adherent to that medication, but also I need to understand what the risks and the benefits are of that medication. And then also collect information on the value of that medication, not only to me, but also to others around me. How well does my medication enhance my family life, as well as my own personal life? So I think it's important about patient activation and that patients participate. We often have pockets of people who participate in research, whether that's clinical development plans for drugs before regulatory approval or post-approval, but we need to get more participation. And I think we can talk about the disparities in clinical trials. Oftentimes, there's underrepresentation of particular populations in clinical trials. How do we know that those drugs or devices work as well in all populations when they've only been studied in some? I think it's really important that we achieve diversity in our clinical trials, as well as in our post-approval surveillance studies that are done. And it's all about patient education and patient activation and bringing people who live with these disorders sort of into that shared decision-making process.
Let me see. Let's see.
So relative to your slide and commentary on responsibilities of stakeholders, can you speak to what the role should be for industry in developing innovative modalities? So again, I think that's a great question. The developers of drugs and devices are clearly the experts in their drug or device, whatever it may be. And I think that the role for the industry, the manufacturers, is to provide clear and concise education to the community. And that education should be delivered in ways where it focuses on mechanism of action, the nuances of the particular drug or device. It should not be presented in the way that this is necessarily the therapeutic option or the diagnostic option that's available. It should be presented with fair balance. And I think this is one of the challenges that industry has in terms of providing fair balance. Because of compliance and regulatory rules, it's challenging for a manufacturer of drug X to really provide fair balance by talking about drugs Y and Z that may be in the same class or comparable. So it really is incumbent then upon the developers to provide information around mechanism of action, safety signals, their preclinical and clinical development plans. But then I think working with healthcare professionals and advocacy organizations to provide that information to them and then enlist their support to provide education directly to healthcare professionals and to consumers. I really believe that it needs to be a strong partnership between the industry as well as the healthcare professionals and the advocacy organizations working in concert together. So let me see what the next question is. How can we collaboratively work to challenge the disability paradox in hemophilia on the journey to health equity? So another great question. I often thought about people who I cared for as they really should not be different than I was. And, I would walk into a clinic room and I would ask the patient, how many joint bleeds have you had in the last 6 months since I saw you? And they would give me some answer, and usually it was not zero. And I would always turn back and I would say, well, that's really unfortunate because in the last 6 months, I've not had one joint bleed. So why should I have no joint bleeds and you have X number of joint bleeds? Why can't we have an equitable outcome? So we would then begin to look at how this individual was providing their care, how they were self-managing themselves. What was leading to, for example, joint bleeding? What was leading to a less than desirable outcome for that individual? And I think, unfortunately, we've had people who live with these disorders sort of become complacent with what I would call a new norm. We all have certain health challenges, but we learn to live with those. And I think people, for example, with severe hemophilia who have joint disease have learned to coexist with their joint disease. And this is their new normal. They can't necessarily walk, 10 flights of stairs. They can't go out for a mile jog. And they compensate by not doing those things. And I think that we need to overcome that disability paradox and really begin to empower people by using new innovative therapies and everything that's available to us in terms of the real world evidence to optimize care and outcomes, to use new diagnostic tools. For example, the point of care ultrasound, I think is going to be incredibly powerful when we can put that in the hands of people who are living with these disorders, as well as the potential for novel biomarkers which could really help us predict the likelihood of bleeding. We're using pharmacokinetics now, but I think there's a lot more that we could do. And it's convincing people that they don't have to live in their current state, that there's opportunities to live a better life. And I think we're seeing that through some of the novel drugs that are providing different mechanisms of action. We're seeing the consistent improvement in quality of life for people who are using, new therapies, whether those are, more intensive prophylaxis, extended half-life factor 8 or factor 9 products, or non-factor therapies. I think it's really going to be important to get that personalized approach for people, but it's important to understand what somebody wants. And, living with joint disease, for example, for me would never be acceptable. I don't have hemophilia, but, I've had my own, musculoskeletal issues in the past, and I've done my work to try to rehab. And I think it's like the quote said, if you want to see a different outcome, you have to make a different choice, and we have to do things differently. So I think it's empowering people who have these disorders to make more choices that are going to achieve more equitable outcomes for them. It's important that they have access to diagnostics and treatments as well, because without access, none of this is going to be possible.
Great, great. Thanks, Len. Got a couple more questions here. First one is, you spoke about NHF's new refocused mission. What are NHF's planned actionable steps towards achieving this mission, and what are you doing in support of new mission vision?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think the first thing is creating a strategic plan that identifies what our goals and objectives are. And I think to that end, it's involving the people who live with these disorders. We talk about patient centricity, but I think it's more people centricity. We need to be inclusive of all people in our community. So I think that's a really important component of this. And then it's also ensuring that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to me, those are two fundamental steps that then provide the foundation for everything else that we can do. And we've thought about how we can make the greatest impact, how NHF can move the needle to the greatest degree. And I think we can focus in 5 particular areas. And the first area is something that I think has challenged all of us at some point during the last 18 months, and that's mental health issues. I think we've seen that become fairly front and center with people like Naomi Osaka, who withdrew from the Olympics, and Simone Biles, who also dropped her challenge for additional medals in the Olympics because of mental health concerns. So I think it's being able to address the mental health issues in our community and being able to acknowledge those as possible challenges for all of us. So we're going to be focusing on mental health, understanding the educational needs of people who live with blood disorders, healthcare professionals, policymakers, and the payers as well, and understand what research needs to be done. The second area that I think we can focus on is in terms of von Willebrand disease. And von Willebrand disease, with the new von Willebrand disease diagnostic and therapeutic guidelines, I think we've got a lot of work to do. It took 6 years to develop the guidelines. It's going to probably take at least 6, if not 12 years, to really realize the full value of those guidelines. And much of that is going to be around education and advocacy and collecting real world data, doing the research that's necessary to support those guidelines. So we've got a lot of work to do in von Willebrand disease to bring von Willebrand disease equity to the same place where we are with, for example, hemophilia. I think the third area that we can focus on is in rare and ultra rare bleeding disorders. I think, again, we've had good educational programs in this area, but we need to have a more comprehensive 360 view of the rare and ultra rare bleeding disorders so that we can achieve health equity in this area. The fourth area that I think we need to focus on is in terms of the new technologies that are coming, the innovative digital technologies. Telehealth, I think, is here to stay, but it's only going to be here as long as we continue to support it and have the appropriate policy and payer decisions made. We need to educate healthcare professionals and people in the community how to use telehealth moving forward. So I think technology is going to be another area that NHF will focus on and really try to bring innovations in this digital space. And the last area that I think we'll continue to focus on is we've made tremendous advances with all the innovation in hemophilia. We've got tremendous new therapies for people with hemophilia, but we need those future therapies to be extended beyond hemophilia and come into play for people with von Willebrand disease and platelet disorders and ultra rare bleeding disorders and sickle cell disease and thalassemia and hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. So future therapies, I think, is going to be an area for us to focus on as well. We've had the very, very successful gene therapy and novel technology workshop. I see us being able to capitalize on efforts like that to bring more innovative science into the organization so that we can better socialize that information, create partnerships in the community. And I'm really looking towards our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Kevin Mills, to really lead that effort. Through the state of the science, I think we're going to have some clear priorities for where innovation needs to take us. And I think, after we have the research blueprint, it's then all around creating what the work is going to need to be to achieve the goals. And again, as I said, the goal is health equity. And we need to do that in hemophilia A and B, in von Willebrand disease, in platelet disorders, in rare and ultra rare bleeding disorders. In the areas, for girls and women and people who have the potential to menstruate, the significant gaps that exist in that population. But we also need to have the infrastructure necessary to support the research, have the funding, have the training, and then it's important to be able to have access. It's the implementation of all of this innovation into the community. If people don't have access, it's useless. So all the best research and all the best innovation goes for naught if people don't have access to it. So I think that's how NHF is going to approach this moving forward. I think we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us, but I anticipate that, with many hands, makes light work. So although we've got a heavy load to shoulder, I think with everybody pulling on the same end of the rope and working together, we can be a strong community.
Great. Thanks, Len. Appreciate that. We have one last question that came in, and I love this question, and I think you will too. It is, if you had to name one thing, what is something everyone in our community could start doing today to improve health equity?
I think it's reflecting on your current situation and reflecting on the situation of those around you. I think it's taking that self-inventory, but then looking beyond your own sphere and what you may be able to do to help your neighbor. I think that's what's incredibly important, is recognizing the needs of those around you and how you might be able to help those around you.
Great. Well, Len, thanks for taking the time to present today. I know this was a little bit short notice, but we appreciate everything that you've done to come in and help us here. I think we might have one more question that came up. Nope. And Carrie, thank you for that comment. We certainly appreciate that and agree with you as well too. But thanks for joining us today, Len, and thanks everyone else for joining us as well too. Please note that this webinar will be available on Friday, July 30th on the events tab at hemophilia.org, along with all of our other archived webinars as well. Thanks again, everyone. Len, thank you for taking the time, and everyone have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.